Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm talking about communication, why it matters, and how we can be better at it. And to do that, I'm joined by the brilliant Amy Kean. Amy is a psychosociologist, educator, and a passionate advocate for better communication in every aspect of our lives, both personally and professionally. She's also the founder of Good Shout, a learning and development company that challenges conventional approaches to training and communication. In our conversation, Amy shares her fascinating journey from advertising to founding Good Shout, her thoughts on why education and communication often go so wrong, and how she's working to fix that. We delve into her unique approach to training, why effective feedback matters, and how poor communication underpins so many of the world's problems. We also explore the role of humour and creativity in making meaningful points. Hear Amy's take on societal trends like the worshipped entrepreneur, and why being willing to experiment and absolutely failing when you do that from time to time is the key to growth. It's an insightful and thought-provoking discussion filled with Amy's trademark wit and honesty. So without further ado, here's my discussion with Amy Kean on communicating effectively. Amy, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much. I hate humans and I love risk. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation.
Amazing. That response is great and I know why you've said that, but many of my listeners won't yet have come across you, although the purpose of the show is obviously to allow them to do that. So can you tell them a little bit about yourself?
I'm a psychosociologist, which is a thing. And that means that ever since I left university, I never stopped studying. And I've studied a range of different, sociology is my wheelhouse, but I've studied parapsychology, which is the study of extraordinary humans, extraordinary brains, and the paranormal, and regular psychology, the psychology of emotion. So I'm technically a scientist, although that is up for debate. Some people would argue that I'm not. Technically a scientist, and I teach humans, study humans, take the piss out of humans for a living.
And tell people a little bit about how do you get paid doing that? Because obviously, we can all wander the streets and look at people and take the piss out of them, but you do actually deliver something as a commercial product. So tell people about that as well.
I do. Well, I run a learning and development company. It's a social learning and development company called Good Shout, which helps people experiment with their voice and their talent and their thinking. So technically, I'm an educator, but my form of education is grounded in the fact that everyone is doing everything wrong, if I'm completely honest. So the way that we communicate at work is wrong. The way that we train people at work is wrong. And that's just not me being a loudmouth, although I also get paid to be a loudmouth, if I'm honest. That's grounded in data and observation from my career in advertising over the last 20 years. So fundamentally, the way that we teach people is incorrect. That's just a fact. And fundamentally, the way that we communicate with each other in the world and at work is incorrect for the most part. So I created Good Shout maybe 3 years ago to try and fix it in a variety of different ways.
And so when you say incorrect, what you mean by that is it's not effective or doesn't do what we think it does?
Oh my God, yes, that's an amazing translation. So let's start with education and then I'll move on to communication. Education, historically, and I'm sure you'll be able to relate to this, has been about control ever since the dawn of time. I mean, maybe at one point in history, it was about enlightening individuals, but over the years, it's become about regulation, making children and adults behave, and teaching them the stuff that is convenient for society rather than opening their minds. I think if you think about the education system that you and I went through, it wasn't a laugh. It didn't blow my mind. It wasn't the most amazing, kids dread going to school. At university, you go there to get drunk for the most part. So, and even when you move into the corporate world, we've all had those training experiences where you sit in a stuffy room for 8 hours and some dude called Malcolm is standing at the front of the room with an overhead projector that has a triangle on a slide, and that's a framework that you have to memorize and repeat, or you take a test that tells you who you are, Myers-Briggs, etc. And that's the corporate world's version of education. And there is so much research that tells us that this doesn't work. It makes people resent education. It makes them fear it. It makes them memorize facts rather than immersing themselves in learning. And that's why I established Good Shout.
I love that whole depiction of it, because I always sort of think we start off and it's a kind of kindergarten. You're allowed to play around and do things and fuck about, basically, for want of a better phrase.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly we get put into these streets where and it's, you always struck me the way, I mean, just the fact that here's history and here's geography, right? And that nicely partitioned, as if those two things were not somehow interrelated. And that's just one silly little example of a ton of other things where it's kind of, you need to learn all this thing. And I was like, why do we suck the joy out of these things? And to your point, it struck me, it was always the teachers that gave a shit, right? That were interested in firing you up, who went off, who didn't do the syllabus stuff, who saw it as, I have to grab people's attention. But then there were tons of them that were just like, I'm here to get you through the exam. And we intuitively know that that's a really, like, a ridiculous construct.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm here to get you through the exam. I'm also here to shout at you every day for a year. And then I'll pass you on to the other human that's going to shout at you every day for a year. And then what we're going to do when you're 11, we're going to make you feel so shit about yourself because we're going to put you into sets. We're going to determine your value as a human being by how well you can memorize this set of facts. And if you're different, you can sit in the corner and you can feel shame for 5 years.
And you're doing all of this, right, with, I don't want to say with your tongue planted to your cheek, because there's a real sense of humor and joy to the way you create. We're sort of almost at the observational comedy end of the spectrum in terms of the way you talk about the world and you engage with it. But you're making a really serious point, right, which is that we deploy your resources to, what is it for? Ostensibly, it's to prepare you for the real world, but it's so artificial that it doesn't really do that.
I love how you've said all of that, because that's it. I think Trevor Robinson wrote an amazing book about how education just sucks the life out of us, essentially, and needs a revolution. But he wrote that a really long time ago, and it's almost impossible. These days, bizarrely, it's almost impossible to revolt because there's far too many people in the world that are comfortable. So when you have something like education, which is such an embedded institution and so many people benefit from the way it is, for example, universities are businesses. I've taught at a couple of universities. I taught media strategy at Bournemouth. I taught the history of creativity at Kingston for, an extended period. And I understand that they are now money-making entities that are driven by commercial success, as well as hopefully a few people learn some stuff. There's so many people that benefit from how things are that I think the only way to cause that revolution that's so desperately needed is to start small and try and to do what I and many others are doing, which is form our own little niche and pocket where at least we can delight some people through the process of learning. In Good Shout, we focus on communication, which we can absolutely get to shortly. But the way that we teach is we never tell people what we're going to teach them and how we're going to teach them. We just ask them to trust us. And so it's a certain type of person that comes to us for education. But our syllabus, if you like, which is still accredited, CPD accredited, is surprising. It's designed to make you stressed. It drags you out of your comfort zone. It's social learning, which means that everyone gives each other feedback. Everyone holds each other accountable. I would say that it's a relatively new type of learning because every single person is involved. You can't have people sitting back. You can't have people being quiet. But at the same time, it's designed for introverts and extroverts and every kind of brain. Hopefully, that might spread over time.
And so if we compare and contrast I'm going to teach you the syllabus, right?
Yeah.
What is it people come out doing differently or thinking differently as a result of what you do?
in any way that you have a voice, in any way that you use your voice professionally for now, but we'll move out into the rest of life later. And in any way that you use your voice professionally, we provide training in it. Public speaking is one, writing is another, articulating ideas is another area that we do, but also the really sensitive stuff at work, giving people feedback, having conflict, listening to others, being honest, and delivering truths within the workplace. All of those things we provide training in. And the outcome will always be twofold. First of all, understanding how you do it and why you do it the way that you do it and how you are able to change the way that you do it. And secondly, a really, really simple sociological best practice. Let me give you an example. We teach people how to give good feedback. Many humans are scarred by bad feedback that they've received in their lives. And I've heard it all. People being told that they have too much energy. What the fuck? That's not being mean. You talk too much. You have too much energy. I don't like the look of your face.
What's it like?
I don't like the look of your face when you're thinking. Feedback I've heard. Not to me directly, but this is feedback that people give. We have a motto at Good Shout, which is what we teach. Feedback is things. Feedback is not feelings. If the entire corporate world did it that way, there'd be millions of humans who weren't scarred by a bad piece of feedback that they received 10 years ago.
I love this. I think this is super, because these are all things that we recognize, like even ignoring silly corporate constructs like annual appraisal, those kind of formal things, right? Just in a day-to-day engagements with people, the things you've talked about are going to happen on some level, in some way, shape, or form. We are going to need to communicate things to people. We are going to need to say things that perhaps are difficult or challenging. And so that, of course, implicitly, what you're thinking, people don't come equipped to deal with that. That's a common feature of everyday life, let alone work. And yet so this is I guess, is it a case of this is the education that people should have had, right? This is you're plugging the gaps to give people skills that allow them to navigate the world. It just happens to be which is why you can drift, I guess, into the personal sphere. But this is something that people are lacking, and it's the root cause of tons of problems and stress within organizations.
Every problem comes from bad communication, if you really think about it. There's no conflict that hasn't arisen from poor communication. There's no relationship that hasn't been destroyed by anything other than poor communication. It's manifested itself in a myriad of different ways. I think you're absolutely right, actually. I think at school, we're taught English, language and literature. How else are you taught to communicate? You're taught the rules that were invented hundreds of years ago, and you read some books. Brilliant. But how to really interact with other human beings, bearing in mind the fact that every single human being is different personalities, neurodiversity, etc. I don't believe that you get taught that at school, and I don't believe that you are taught how important communication is, really decent, respectful communication. Also, I don't believe that you get taught discipline in communication at school. How to make a good point. How to move on when you've done that. How to listen. Did you learn how to listen at school? I guess it's listening comprehension, but again, that's based on like listening to English texts and it's not the same. We teach listening. Guess how many types of active listening there are? You might know.
No idea. I actually genuinely don't.
Guess.
I'm guessing the number will be quite big, like 10 or something.
There's 7 different types of listening
that
we employ every single day. Bias listening, emotional listening, empathetic listening, regular listening, like informational listening, etc. We don't realize that we're doing those 7 things every single day. Often human beings don't appreciate the discrimination and the bias that they're listening with. I could be in a terrible mood this morning. I would be listening to you in a totally different way. I could have pissed you off yesterday and you would be listening to me in a totally different way.
I think this is super fascinating. And I love that idea of or miscommunication being the heart of things. And I think what the bit that really resonates for me is that idea of pissing people off. And so one of the things that I do in my work is looking in the compliance space. And I sort of describe the tagline for my business is, my publisher didn't like this for my book, but I love it for the business, which is how to get people to do what you want without pissing them off. And the idea here is that visceral thing is, it really is incredibly powerful. And so we can ignore complimentary messages that are delivered, if there's a sting in the tail or it's delivered in an unpleasant way. And so I think this idea of getting to the heart of how we engage with each other to avoid bad outcomes, whatever those bad outcomes might be, it resonates hugely with me, but I think is incredibly significant when we look at wasted effort of people fuming about things or people sort of just shutting down, not being willing to listen. And particularly we can see that in this polarized world that we live in at the moment. And I think I love the fact that you're onto something incredibly visceral there.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we were to go macro for a second with my psychosociology hat on, I think the world is steadily going to shit because we've forgotten how to communicate. Well, I mean, primarily it's going to shit because a bunch of men are blowing countries up. That's a fact. There's probably a communication issue there too, but ego is a massive driver in the world imploding. However, if we were to look at on an everyday basis, think about all the stuff that is terrible because communication is bad. Social media, terrible. Either incredibly confrontational and nasty and vicious and filled with bullies and designed to hurt people whilst also make them addicted. And then at the other end, you've got the really quite damaging trend for what people call people pleasing. People pleasing and being nice, the weaponization of kindness. That's two ends of a very significant scale because we've forgotten how to communicate with other people. We're either shouting at them in social media or avoiding confrontation at all costs in real life. There's been a bunch of studies recently, and I wish I could quote the authors, but there's been a bunch of studies recently about how people in real life won't share their opinions anymore because we're just terrified of the repercussions. Now, some people shouldn't share their opinions. Some people are gross. But if regular people are really, really scared just to say, oh, I don't think I get this, or, oh, actually, I think if maybe a thing that's going on, if real people are scared to say stuff like that, we're really going to go to a dangerous place, a very clinical, quiet place in life.
And you mentioned social media, so this is probably a really good point to jump into what you do there. It's how I came across you, because I sort of spend my time looking for interesting voices. And you're not just interesting, you're, as people will have detected, incredibly engaging and willing to sort of just call things out and speak with not really, I mean, it's almost living the values that you've preached in terms of what your business is trying to do. Just talk a little bit about what you do on there, because it's just, I was sort of scrolling through before in preparation for the show. This will shock listeners. I do actually do some preparation for the show, but I was just reading sort of back and thinking, because I wanted to get to the essence of I always like to think, why do I want this person on the show?
Yeah.
And it was just, I just kept reading it, and it's sort of this, I don't know, it's joyously honest, but it's fun, and it's sort of not taking life too seriously, but you do make some incredibly serious points within that. So I wonder, is it possible to encapsulate, what's your strategy, or how do you go about that?
God, it's a very good question. I think when you're a sociologist, and I always come back to being a sociologist and the fact that I've never stopped studying. I'm finally doing my master's soon in Carl Jung. I don't know if you know Carl Jung.
Yeah.
Obsessed with Carl Jung and his work on the imagination and dreams and the self. But I've never stopped studying. I've studied at Cornell and the University of Edinburgh, and I haven't stopped over the last 10 years in particular, when you're a sociologist, all you do is watch people. Literally all you do. And try to fathom why they're doing the things they do. And that's generally in social media. I'll take the piss out of cliches. I'll observe movements that I think are damaging to society. I really care about society, and I really care about the collective. And I think over time, the collective is being damaged. I think we're nurturing a society full of main characters. I think, I worked in advertising for 20 years. I think advertising is the worst thing that's ever happened to humanity. I think it's all about manipulation and lies and hyperbole and all of that stuff. And I feel incredibly embarrassed about the fact that I worked in advertising for 20 years. Everything I do is a hot take on society. But if we're not able to laugh at the fact that we are the way we are, then what's the point? Also, what I realized, actually, I used to be a lot more sanctimonious than I am now, if I'm honest. I've written for years and I have a column and I've written for The Guardian and stuff. I used to be a lot more sanctimonious than I am now. And I've realized, actually, particularly when it comes to engaging men, if you do it with humor, you're able to say a lot more. And I think you're able to reach a lot more people if you do it in a lighthearted way. People don't like being preached at.
As I read your stuff, it's kind of getting ideas out of your head, I guess. And is it cathartic for doing what you do? Are you on how does that work? Because one of the things, there's a lot of people that sort of approach social media with, I must put some content out here and I will put some template, it's like follow the rules. And I can't stand this formula, sort of stuff that's got no imagination, that's like following standards. And yours, I never quite know what's going to come. I've got a rough idea of the sort of angle that you're going to take on things, but it's joyous to read because there's always something in there that surprises, delights, or just makes me think.
Yeah.
Is it you getting ideas, or how does that work for you in terms of, I presume you've got lots of ideas bouncing around your head that you just want to get out there, or is it you come across something that really pisses you off, or what's the driver?
All of those things. What was it? I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything that I've written or created lately that you're referring to specifically? Is this putting you on the spot?
No, well, let's talk about, there was something you put out there today, which was about someone you described as your nemesis. So I think for me, that would be a good example of the kind of thing where I agree with you. I was shocked by what I saw, but you sort of had a quite amusing take on it. So let's talk about that as an example.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm really interested in social movements, and the rise of the worshipped entrepreneur is a social
I love that
movement.
phrase. That's great.
It's a social movement that you absolutely cannot ignore, especially on LinkedIn. James Watt, BrewDog weren't on my radar for a very long time. I knew that they were doing some kind of punk-related activity. And I saw that on International Women's Day, maybe a few years ago, they'd done a stunt where they released a pink IPA. And I thought that was utterly ridiculous. And so then they came onto my radar. And
so for listeners that are unfamiliar, let's just step back and say, so BrewDog is a sort of craft beer brewery that sets out to be deliberately disruptive and provocative.
Yeah.
And so both in the branding, and they started out, I think, just as a brewer. They now own various mega pubs, I think would probably be the best way to describe it, across the UK. And so deliberately setting out to be provocative and controversial.
Yeah. Have you seen the comedian Alistair Green?
Yes.
Yeah. So he did, a few years ago, he did a skit that was called Punk Squirrel IPA, which I don't know if you can edit this and do like a little audio clip.
Totally.
My name's Matt, and I'm Matt, and we've just started our own craft beer company. Punk Squirrel IPA, Punk Squirrel IPA. I use the profits from my buy-to-let properties to invest in a microbrewery. And I use my experience as a senior creative at Saatchi & Saatchi to come up with the brilliant branding. Punk Squirrel IPA, Punk squirrel, IPA. He's a squirrel, but he's a punk? Say what? I'm 43. Punk squirrel, IPA. Punk squirrel, IPA.
It's a guy with a backwards baseball cap on going, squirrel, IPA, punk squirrel, IPA. I'm a rebel. And then it's a guy like on a skateboard going, I got divorced and I can't see my kids. And it's essentially profiling a midlife crisis. And these guys, and it's based on BrewDog, and it's these guys who pretend to be punks when in reality they're very, very much not. And my tipping point, this is actually really important. My tipping point was during the Qatar World Cup, where James Watt made a massive statement saying, we stand for human rights, so we're selling a special human rights beer. And all of the profits we make, we're still going to show the World Cup in our pubs, of course, but all the profits that we make from this human rights beer during the Qatar World Cup will be going to some charities. They didn't name the charities. And I just thought, Jesus Christ, this is the perfect example of some kind of washing. You're using genuine human rights concerns to make money, pretend that you're good, and you're turning it into a stunt. And that was my moment where I thought, this dude is my nemesis. He will never know that he's my nemesis. I am irrelevant to him. But the way that, and then obviously there were a bunch of documentaries. I think there was a radio documentary and then a TV documentary about the fact that allegedly there'd been some bullying at BrewDog, and allegedly there'd been some cases of sexual harassment, and all of that combined just made me think, is this leadership in 2024? Because this guy is worshipped.
So the interesting thing here is, as you say, the sort of the worship of the individual.
Yeah.
And yet the practices are quite toxic. So what I think is interesting is if we combine those two dynamics, you've got on the one hand these awful stories about bad business practices that are being exposed. So very 21st century dynamic of things that probably were more prevalent in certain across business, I guess, are now being exposed, thanks in part to technology. And so we're getting more visibility on these poor behaviors. So that's dynamic one. And then ranged against that is this sort of hero worship thing that you point out. And you would think that both of those things rely very heavily, I think, on social media, but traditional media plays its role as well. You would think that what would happen with the transparency and exposure of what's happening in the business, people would go, oh, and the stars would somehow fall, that there would be some form of revulsion at what is happening. And yet we seem to, it's almost like it's got worse, because it's almost like the more you hear about these awful stories, people kind of ignore that because they're already wedded to the dream and the vision and the whatever. And I don't understand. I don't understand this. You can see it in politics as well, right? Sort of hero worship of very, very flawed people. And that's not to say that we should see everything they do as negatively, but clearly there are some major negative anchors there that just get ignored.
Absolutely. And when you were describing that, I immediately thought of Donald Trump.
Right.
And also figures like Andrew Tate, in which I'm not going to compare James Watt to Andrew Tate. He's definitely not that bad. However, the process that you're describing is almost like an act of rebellion, I think. Obviously, you have lots of people complaining about wokeness and how the world has become too politically correct and cancel culture, etc. Cancel culture, I'm not even entirely sure it does exist. It's just people being held accountable for stuff that they've done. But I think worship of these people who have very high profile misdemeanors, and a lot of it's been proven, support of them is genuinely an act of rebellion.
Ah, okay, that's interesting, right? So I kind of know it's wrong.
Yeah.
But the definition of wrong is set by the machine, the system, the whatever, and therefore I'm going to rebel against. So even if intuitively I actually recognize this is, for what I basic human instinct or whatever it is, right? So you don't necessarily even need to think I've been taught that this is wrong. You will on some level viscerally understand that, but that's kind of, there's a bit of a thrill, I guess, and a sense of you're fighting the machine if you support that, right? It's an act of rebellion.
Totally.
Right.
You know, it's really interesting. When was the Qatar World Cup? Was it last year, the year before?
Yeah, it was like, I'm just trying to think from football seasons, but so it was last season, so that would be about a year ago from when we're recording this.
What?
Yeah.
That's really feels a lifetime ago. Anyway, I posted about, and it was one of those posts that went a little bit viral, and whenever something goes viral, you welcome in the dregs of society, of course. I've had posts go viral a few times, and there's always a tipping point where you start getting attacked by strangers.
Right.
I posted about the Qatar stunt and how they were still making.
Correction, it was 2022. I've just looked it up.
Oh,
so
right,
I'm
okay.
completely wrong. I just wanted to go. I noticed there was discombobulation there, as I said a year ago, 2 years ago, Amy. I apologize.
I was testing you to see how much of a man you are, and
Listen, I fail on, but by traditional metrics, I fail, and I don't care. That's fine by me.
So I posted about this because I believe that it's morally incorrect to profit from human rights violations. That's just me. That's just me and my weird beliefs. But I posted about it and I said it was kind of outrageous. After it reached that viral tipping point, I had men calling me a whore. I had men like shaming me. Who are you? Like that's.
Do you know what I love? Who are you is a really dumb question because it's obvious, right? It's on social media. In your name, you're not hiding, but you're not like a little avatar, right? That's invisible, right? You are doing it. Who are you? Great question.
Yeah, I have a bio on this very page. Then, yeah, all questions answered. I don't even know who you are. Okay.
So that's an interesting thing. So you know what, right? You play with this, right? So I would say courageous, but I think it's just you being you. So I'm gonna recoil from saying courageous in that sense. But it could be wearing if you took it the wrong way. And I do think one of the things that is interesting about your post is you are unashamedly you.
Yeah.
And that's what makes them delightful. It's kind of like, I'm going to say what I think. It's the antidote to what you were saying before, right? Like normal people feeling unable to speak out is you clearly do feel able to speak. And I think it's very authentic. And I don't feel ever that there's any sense of compromise in terms of positions. You just go for it. And that's very refreshing. I mean, it's an antidote to all the sort of social media generic templatey stuff. But that does take some effort, right? And that is not something that everybody is equipped to do, either in terms of the resilience that they've got, or they might not feel the one thing they want to talk about is something that lends itself to being attacked. And as you say, once you get the bigger numbers, and I've started to see this as well, there are certain tipping points where suddenly it's like it suddenly switches on.
Yeah.
But for no apparent good reason. And it can happen on very random things that one isn't expecting it on.
Oh my God, absolutely. The thing is, I run a company that celebrates the voice, and I have a bunch of different missions, I suppose, but I really want the context and why I use social media so much, just for context, and I would imagine lots of people are the same, which is why I'm sharing it, is I'm from Essex. And I have less of an accent now, but I still have a bloody accent. And throughout my working life, particularly at the beginning, I really struggled to be heard. And I felt like I had so much to say. And I was really interested in stuff and curious about stuff. But the organizations that I worked in, I didn't feel like anyone was listening to me, or I didn't feel like anyone wanted to listen to me because I had this voice. I had this high-pitched Essex voice that comes with its own connotations. And so I started to use social media to be heard. When you write, you don't have an accent. When you write, it's almost a leveler, isn't it? People can read it in any way they wish. And so social media over the years genuinely became such an important outlet for me. And that's why I've created an organization that helps people find their voice through education, is because I don't want other people to feel like they're not heard.
And I find that incredibly interesting because you're right. Accents are, that does sort of stereotype people.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of presumptions that come with that.
Yeah.
And I say this as a white male who speaks reasonably well. I'm not, although often inarticulately as I'm demonstrating now, but it is incredibly interesting. And I think that idea of I want to be heard, I think that points to a lot of again, not suggesting this is what you're saying, but social exclusion and people fighting the machine, doing things because they just want somebody to listen to what they have to say.
Yeah.
And the constructs that with the traditional constructs prevent that from happening. So I think this beautifully, again, back to the authenticity point, this beautifully encapsulates what you're about and what you're trying to do, which is really for humans to be effective and for humans to feel included and therefore not feel excluded and do things that we wouldn't necessarily want, requires them to be heard and to know how to communicate, but also how to listen to others, I guess.
Oh my God, totally. I love how you're saying this. One of the negative impacts of not feeling heard is that you adopt behaviors that people cannot ignore. Maybe that's where trolling comes from for some people. The only way they can get attention is by being vicious and spiteful, when in reality, that's not them. I think that's probably a driver for lots of people who are really mean in social media. They just want someone to pay attention to them. Obviously, that's not okay, but I think if the mass were given the tools to communicate effectively at an earlier age, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation. I really care about public speaking for state schools. I know that Keir Starmer, when he was campaigning for the most recent election, said that he was going to make public speaking for state education a thing, which it isn't. When you go to private school, you get taught how to debate.
Yeah.
No, I never got that when I went to school. I think if people from regular schools had more confidence when it comes to communication and were taught to communicate with more clarity and more impact, they would be heard more. I wish I'd been given a better education when it comes to communication, genuinely.
And so, I mean, you are a very effective communicator and you talked about your studies. And obviously that points to a direction of understanding humans. And if we are trying to communicate, logically, we are communicating. I mean, occasionally we communicate with animals and some people talk to inanimate objects, but most of us are trying to communicate to other humans. So you've clearly got a natural ability in this space, but I'm intrigued. You say you weren't educated in or taught in it, and yet you've clearly got a very powerful voice because it resonates well. Is that just a function of your studies or where have you picked that up from?
I think it's born out of necessity. Over the last 20 years, I do conferences all the time now. I speak at events and stuff. But 20 years ago, I would puke if the thought of standing in front of a room. And when I started to do conferences, I would cry afterwards because my nerves would be so overwhelming. But I think because I've been so desperate to be, maybe it's an act of rebellion because people weren't listening to me. I was like, you're going to fucking listen. So I think maybe that was. And so I've honed it. I've honed it over the years. And every single time I speak, I optimize. Every single time, I have a tone of voice that I've optimized over the last 20 years. I have things that I say that I've optimized based on the responses that I get. I think it's come from, 20 years ago when I spoke, no one would listen. And I think I've honed it. I've genuinely honed it, which is why it's why I can teach it well, because I've honed all these tools and these techniques to be heard.
So when you say optimize,
Yeah.
you mean, so you try things out and
Yeah.
if they work, you do them again. If they don't work, you don't. Very simple. Right. So I kind of call that experimenting, where
Yeah.
I sort of, you lean on the greatest hits, right? Jokes that people will laugh at.
Yeah.
But also every time I do a presentation, there is always something I have never done before,
Yeah.
either content wise or just a way of presenting, just like an experimental element. And so I look at that comparatively to like comedians that go and do, before they do the big tour, they'll go and do the dingy pubs or whatever, just
Yeah.
to kind of test it out with an audience to see what works. So you're constantly, it's almost, there's an experimental feel to it. So not everything is experimental. You lean on the greatest hits, I presume, to do that. But you have some elements of things that you're trying out. So it's constantly evolving. So in other words, I'm guessing you're the same as me. It's like no two things you ever do will be exact. The audience might not know the difference, but you're testing new things out as a way of iterating to get to something even better. And so it's always work in progress on some level.
Utterly, you brilliantly said. Our strapline at Good Shout, and you'll see it emblazoned on the homepage, is "We are all experiments." So this is exactly how we think and feel, and it's how I live. There's a quote from Alain de Botton, who is such a hero of mine, the philosopher. And he said, if you're not embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago, you're not learning enough.
I've been looking for the origins of that quote because I keep saying it to people. Thank you. You've just solved. I misremembered, so I ended up. I was like searching for. I couldn't find it, and then I thought I'll go. I know generative AI will tell me, and I was like, no, that's the one.
It was generative AI. Will credit it to fucking Mark Twain
Or George Orwell's the other go.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So right. So I love that. Okay. So you're, and I guess that's the it's almost like the permission to look stupid
Yes.
thing, right? We go for it.
Yeah.
Does that point to your volume on social media? I don't mean volume as in loudness. I mean volume as in amount of content.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's, if you can have, what that requires, weirdly, is a little bit of humility and ability to make mistakes and sometimes know that you're creating something which you did feel passionately about at the time, but just didn't land with other people. It's okay to have some opinions and to make some things that don't land with others. That's absolutely fine. So I don't mind if I write something or create something. I released I had a poetry collection published during COVID, which I adored. It's called House of Weeds, and it's written about. Let me really quickly give you the context because I think I was just so self-indulgent. I love weeds because, well, first of all, one of my best friends, a guy called Jack Wallington, is like a celebrity gardener, and he.
Okay, so this is weeds as in not flowers, as opposed to the plural of something one might, as a plural of illicit substances.
Oh no, God, I cannot stand cannabis. It turns me into a psycho, hungry and paranoid.
Right, just to clarify, obviously not for me, Amy, just for certain listeners who might have thought that, right? Okay, so we're talking about things that we would normally take out of in the flower bed. You would remove the weeds.
Well, yes. And so my friend Jack, who's a celebrity gardener, released a book a few years ago called Wild About Weeds. And he wants us to fall in love with weeds because at some point in history, a bunch of people decided that certain flowers were weeds. Not because they're not beautiful. The poppy is a weed, but because they are unpredictable and unruly. So a bunch of people said, well, they must be banished from the garden. We don't want them in gardens. I think there's incredible parallels there with humans.
I love that.
Yeah, it's really, also read the book Wild About Weeds. It's an amazing, beautiful book that gives you information about what weeds you can and should grow in your garden. And so I wrote a poetry collection called House of Weeds, which was about this fictional house filled with human beings that every single poem, 37 poems, every single one was written about a weed, but like it had the characteristics of a human. And I released that, and you know what? 50 people must have bought it. It didn't land. However, that doesn't matter. I'm okay with that. I had fun writing it. So maybe I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed by some of it. And I don't think I'm never going to write another poetry collection again because the fucking effort that it takes, honestly. But, it's a learning.
I like that idea of writing for you.
Yeah.
And getting ideas out there, because when I wrote my book, one of the things that I thought was I will put down in writing so people will have a reference, that sort of thing, and it'll be good for marketing. But what I subsequently realized was, yes, it does all those things, right? No question. But what I also realized was that it was just an outlet, place to put ideas and thoughts so they could come out and they go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And also that whole thing about structuring one's thoughts as you write and all those other benefits. And so I think actually having the courage to put that stuff out there and being willing to fail at it, the success is fine, because the success of something isn't necessarily how many you sell. Because if I look at the charts as a good example, music charts, or we can put, the amount of crap, really, just sort of mass-produced nonsense that seems to do quite well.
Yeah.
And it astonishes me. It's another one of those constructs where, Sunday Times bestseller. Well, it might be brilliant, right? There may be loads of people bought, but there may also be a bunch of idiots who've bought this thing. And we can see also, things that fly on social media. And you sort of go, those inspirational quotes that I know you take the piss out of.
Ah, yeah.
Today is a new day. Be the best version of yourself. And it gets like 1,000 likes. And you're like,
Yeah.
who are these people liking this stuff? So I think just because something is popular isn't necessarily a benchmark for it being any good. And who's to decide, who's the arbiter of that anyway? So I love this idea that you've put, poetry sounds like a hell of a lot of work. But I love this idea that you've put this thing out there and you're like, right, okay, 50 copies, what the hell, right? And they're not all going to be you. That's the other joyous thing. So there are at least, so even if you bought a few, right, to boost the numbers, there's going to be about 40 odd people that have bought this thing. And we'll get a few more because we're going to...
Hey, stop it. Crazy.
Yes.
Copies, I don't have to buy them. My last thing you've knocked down, I said 50 and you've knocked it down to 40. Just because it's
we keep going. No, I just feel it's in the spirit of the exercise to make it it really doesn't matter. And I think that's but I love this idea, the weeds thing, that fascinates me because you're right. It's we need the flower bed must look nice based on conventional forms of what looks nice. But actually, if we think about sort of sterile environments and what that does for kids and, our resilience to diseases and, maybe we just had a pandemic where people were more vulnerable as a result of, not having exposed themselves. So I think it points to it's unnatural, actually, what the weeding out process. And so I love this idea of taking that into the human sphere. I think that's fascinating.
Shit. Well, maybe you've convinced me to re-release it.
Well, I'm happy. Listen, if this is the one thing that comes out of the show, I'm gonna buy a copy because I'm genuinely interested in where your mind takes you on the subject. I'm gonna buy a copy of the other book as well. Links to both of those will be in the show notes, Amy. He said, not forgetting his PR machine bit as well. But I'll put links to those things there. But I think this whole idea is super interesting. And I think one of that links back nicely to your whole idea about communicating. Implicit in all the things you've been saying is to communicate in a human way, in a natural way.
Yeah.
And so all of that sits together.
It does. It does. I suppose to the naked eye, I might appear to be quite shambolic and inconsistent because I talk about so many things, but at the crux of it is the human condition and how we treat each other. But that manifests itself in so many different ways. I see all these other people, these people who make money, not dissimilar to me, make money from doing conferences and being asked to do away days and stuff. And they have one thing, like one really specific thing that they talk about. And that's the thing that they're known for. And that has so much value. But I just don't want to do that. I always think, I don't know if you feel the same. I always think, God, my life would be so much easier from a business perspective, from a money-making perspective, if I just talked about X.
Yes.
But I don't want to.
Well, I think it's unnatural in a way because it's basically saying you are defined by this one thing, this sort of slim pillar of expertise or experience or whatever. And you almost like you come and do a rinse and repeat of the thing you've done a million times before.
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of think, I don't want to do that because I'm going to fall asleep.
Yeah.
And also like we are messy, right? We're a bunch of, and I find it very, a lot of to your point, a lot of the constructs that we have nowadays require us to be consistent. And, not allowed to, they've changed their mind, you're flip-flopping on. Well, actually, I think it's quite a good thing, right? If you dive into a subject or you speak to other people and you discover that maybe your preconceptions about a subject were not actually, aren't actually matched with reality and we should shift, shifting, because I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
Yeah.
And so I hate this idea. I was once told what you need to do if you want to speak at conferences is have things you've done a million times before.
Yeah.
And my view, particularly post the pandemic in an in-person setting, is if I'm going to do a presentation, right, these people have, and I know many of them may have been sort of press gang to be there or whatever, right? But these people have made an effort on some level to rock up to a physical location or logged in or whatever. And I think they're entitled to have something that is of the moment, right, is unique to them. It's an experience. because I don't think it's good enough to just turn up and roll out the same old thing, because that's an on-demand product.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's, what's the most interesting thing is other people. Why do I do this show? To have interesting conversations with other people, so that I can learn from them, my audience can learn from them, we can engage, and so I love this idea of you saying, well, effectively, I'm not consistent, I'm human, right? And I just think that for me, that's so blindingly obvious, and I think it's when people are rocking up and phoning it in,
Yeah.
and I just think that's lazy.
Yeah. Lazy, complacent. It is. Yeah. I the trick is, I think I'm realizing the trick is with this sort of stuff, be so entertaining that people will let you talk about anything.
Right.
Be so consistently, if you can be consistently entertaining or consistently interesting, regardless of what you say, because that's the one thing I will say in my defense. I'm consistent when it comes to my quality
Yeah.
of delivery. If you can be trusted by enough people in terms of that, then that's a really good thing, because and I would imagine you're the same. You have it's consistent standard that you refuse to dip below.
Yes.
Then I think that's a really brilliant place to be. This week, actually, I did a conference and they allowed me to use some new material. And I did an entire presentation on dreaming and how I've been studying dreaming a lot this year, reading about it, interviewing loads of people like artists and their relationship with dreaming. And I did a 30-minute presentation, which I got paid for, on our relationship with dreaming and how dreams are the most untapped creative resource known to humanity. And I did that because from a psychosociology point of view, there's psychiatrists are talking about pathologizing daydreaming. And there's a condition that they've named maladaptive daydreaming or immersive daydreaming, which is apparently where individuals daydream too much. And I found out about that this year and think it's such a dangerous territory, because who gets to decide if someone's daydreaming too much? Who gets to decide how much is too much? And what should you be doing instead? Working, using technology? It feels like such a weird territory. So they allowed me to do a whole presentation on it. And it probably wasn't perfect in terms of delivery, because I didn't have, my notes and I didn't know it cold, i.e. inside out, backwards, forwards, all of that stuff. But the passion was probably more than...
Right, way more important, right,
Yeah.
in a way. So I find that really interesting, because some of my listeners will know this, you probably won't. I spend half my time in Munich in Germany and half my time in London.
Yeah.
And I commute between the two by train. And and some of that was environmental, but some of it was also like, it's a really good time to have, right, to sit there. It's a very high quality journey experience. And staring out of the window is a really, really important part of the thing. So I will often go longer journeys with nicer route, right, along the Rhine valleys. Beautiful thing. You can just stare at this wonderful scenery, and like stuff occurs to me as a result of, and that in essence is daydreaming.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that you can do too much of it is anathema to me, because I deliberately set up my life where every few weeks I'm spending an entire day traveling by train through, some of it is just tunnels where you can't see anything. Some of it, the industrial heartlands of Germany, you might think is like not particularly pretty to look at. But again, right, chimney stacks and things coming out, you can get all sorts of interesting ideas, and there's a constantly changing landscape. So this idea that you could do too much of that, I think is insane. One, because it's, as you say, who sets the limits? But the second thing is, it's kind of like, if we're all doing the generic stuff, right, if we're all doing the serious thing, then where's the interesting new stuff going to come from?
Mm-hmm.
And we've been given this talent, and we all have it. That's the bit I love about it. This is very inclusive. So the idea that anybody would time limit that seems to me to be weird.
It's incredibly weird. It's one of the criteria. As with anything in psychology, the way that you find out that you have a disorder is by taking a quiz.
Right.
You find out if you're a psychopath when you take a 40-question quiz. And if you answer enough, it means you're a psychopath. I mean, it's always been flawed. One of the criteria for maladaptive daydreaming is that you obsessively listen to music.
Meaning lots of it, or things on repeat, or
Who knows? Who knows? But someone, also the psychiatric industry, the psychology it's not known for its creativity. So why do they get to decide how much we're allowed to imagine? And essentially what they say with maladaptive daydreaming, and I love that we've even gone here. I can't even remember what we first started talking about at the beginning of this podcast.
yeah, don't worry about it.
But one of the things is that some people, sometimes related to trauma, they use it as a form of escapism, but we all deal with shit in our own way. Sometimes people will create entire worlds and storylines, even soap operas in their head, and they'll return to those stories when they get a spare moment. And sometimes they'll use music as a gateway. That to me doesn't sound like a neurological or a mental disorder. That to me sounds like a human being doing a thing with the brain that's in their head. And that's, you wonder if, I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but the pharmaceutical industry is having a lovely time at the moment. Lovely time with a variety of different new disorders. So it's quite kind of handy when stuff is pathologized.
But I just like, as you were talking there, I'm just thinking, isn't it way healthier that someone kind of listens to lots of music and kind of has imaginative ideas? I mean, yeah, there's a limit to these things, right? You don't want people who obsess about things. That's a risky thing as well.
Yeah.
But just the broad idea that we might do that seems to me to be slightly better than people often, and I don't know, getting stuck into the absinthe, right?
Or using technology. Technology use hasn't been pathologized yet. But that's, people can spend 14 hours a day using technology. How is that not a disorder? If
Right.
you ask, Carl Jung, the legend, he said that the only way to really get to know ourselves is by spending a decent amount of time with our own imaginations.
Love that. Absolutely love that. Wow. So many things. I'm just conscious of the clock, Amy, because I know you're a busy person. We've covered so. Is there anything that we should have talked about that we haven't yet that sits in your wheelhouse?
I did my second TEDx talk last week in Germany, funnily enough. I did it in Münster.
I saw that. I was glad you reminded me. I saw that. It's an interesting place for a TEDx thing, but I love it when people do them in eclectic places. And I probably have a few listeners in Münster knowing my luck, and they won't be happy with me describing it like, but fascinating. Yes, tell us about that.
It was on weirdness, which again is a part of the sociology of normality. All of this stuff is intertwined. The sociology of normality is in and of itself flawed. Normality is fiction. The word normal wasn't used to describe human beings until the 18th century. And even then it was in medical terms, i.e. normal height, weight, build, as health services became more mainstream. The concept of normality is a terrible thing. And so it keeps people in line. And that's so many of the themes that we talked about today: education, how we talk to each other, what's allowed and what isn't in terms of imagining versus technology. All of that stuff is grounded in what we believe is normal and what isn't normal. And so that was what my talk was on.
I love that. And I think it's back to, I'm fascinated by the perspective of sort of compliance in the loosest sense of the word, and how we get people to follow, do the sort of what's deemed to be odd, weird behavior and criticized. And I think, for me, that's not to say that all behavior should be tolerated. Clearly, there are things that are, for example, antisocial, where that's showing a lack of respect to other people. And I think there are limits. But I love this idea of, whether that's the clothes that people wear or the language that they use. And I think it's interesting when we think about communication. I'm a little bit of a sort of, not grammar and punctuation fundamentalist, because I get things wrong, but I like things to be comprehensible. I don't want to read things that I look at and go, this is illiterate crap. I can't get this isn't communicating effectively with me. Yeah. But I also like people that play with language, and I like people that, and I bought a book recently actually where it is one long sentence. It's the entire construct of the book.
I've got that fucking book,
which I haven't yet. I just picked it up in the bookshop, and I was like, I couldn't quite put and I'll put a link to this in the show. I can't remember what it's called. It's translated into English from from it's something Eastern European, isn't it? And I looked at it and just thought, this looks really cool. I've got to buy this because I love the construct, but I haven't yet settled down because I feel like, and this is me thinking, I feel like I ought to read it in one sitting, right? Because of that, which is idiotic, right? It's my call as to where I stop reading. But I haven't, I love the idea. I've got it sitting there. I haven't yet dared start for that.
I couldn't get into it, I'll be honest. I found it annoying.
But that's fine. But that's legit, right? It's like you give
Yeah.
it a go. I think that the other thing. I'm guessing you're like. I mean, I read hundreds of books a year. I don't finish them all,
Mhm.
but I just kind of you get into them, and then you go in the same way. I always think it's weird when people sit through things that they're not enjoying or a point. No,
Yeah.
it's not really. You need to give things time. But I'm like, if I go to the cinema and it's crap, I'm
Yeah.
going to walk out. Right? I don't like. It's idiotic to sit there for another hour's worth of crap that you find offensive. And so, and I know the theatre, there's a sort of, well, we owe it to the actors to sit through it. And I'm like, well, no, I don't have to sit there for the entire production if it's not giving. Ditto books, start reading it. If it's not delivering anything, walk on. Why double down on something that's not working for you?
I think it's something to do with our psychological need for closure in things. I recently did that with the book Wicked, which is the book that the musical is based on.
Right.
I found it too sexual. I found it just a bit too. Ugh. Not that sex is bad, but it wasn't what I was expecting at all. Very different to what I believe the theme of the storyline of the musical is, which I haven't seen yet, but I will. I'm going on Monday.
I mean, so that you can walk out in disgust and go, not sexual enough.
I have a specific idea of how much sex is allowed in my entertainment, and it's like Goldilocks. And if there is too much or too little, I will end that experience.
I think, Amy, that is the phrase on which to end what has been a truly joyous conversation. Thank you for entering into this. I knew you would, right? But thank you for entering into the spirit of the show. If people want to find out more about what you do, get you in to do some of these amazing things, where can they find you?
We've just relaunched our website, goodshoutcommunity.com. So look at that, please.
Amazing. A link to that for people who didn't have a pen to hand or can't remember that many letters or words in the show notes with everything. And I will put a link to your social media stuff because that's how I found you. And I would encourage people to go follow you on the various networks because you are an absolute joy to see. But the most important thing is thank you for being an absolutely amazing guest on the show.
Thank you. I've had a wonderful time.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Amy for appearing. To find out more about Amy, her company Good Shout, her poetry collection House of Weeds, and the other books that we mentioned on the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. I know I always ask for this, but if you have enjoyed this episode or any others on the show, please do leave a review. It genuinely helps others to discover the show. And for you to discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Take a moment to reflect on how you communicate with others. It might just make a world of difference. And thank you so much for listening.